Good evening. It's quite tired. I'm quite tired. But I can't fall asleep. So I think we'll read a happy little story. So I picked, of course, the happiest, littlest story I could think of. I think we'll just start from the first story. H.P. Lovecraft, huh? There's an introduction. I think we'll read the introduction. Well, let's just, we're not in any hurry here. Take a look at the table of contents. Here's the first page. Right. There's probably a dozen and a half stories there. And then, of course, you have a complete second and third page. Right, this has got to be 40 to 50 more stories, right? And then I've got 6 more stories on this final page. So I don't know, I think that adds up to probably around 60 stories, if I had to guess. Maybe it says somewhere. Not apparently. Sure, maybe some kind of afterthought? No, not really. There's a timeline. No, we're just going to have to stick with that estimate, I think. Call it 60 stories. The introduction. Let's take a look at this. Oh, it's not that long. It's only 5 or 6 pages. So we'll put our bookmark where we intend to stop. And we'll go ahead. It's so easy for me to get dehydrated. Okay. The introduction. So there's a quote here, an H.P. Lovecraft quote. "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." H.P. Lovecraft understood that to be truly frightening, weird tales of supernatural horror must force us to confront the vast indifference of the cosmos, and to recognize that human beings are as insignificant as specks of dust. Although he only had a small readership during his short lifetime, from 1890 to 1937, so he was only 47 when he died. Although he only had a small readership, Lovecraft has influenced generations of writers, and today he is acknowledged to be an important, albeit minor, figure in the American literary pantheon. Lovecraft's literary fame is modest in comparison with his modernist contemporaries, such as T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yet his cultural influence has been dramatic and substantial. While virtually all writers of supernatural horror of the past 100 years trace their parentage back to Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft helped pave the way for such modern masters of contemporary American Gothic fiction as Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Neil Gaiman, as well as a host of emerging authors such as Laird Barron and Thomas Ligotti. I hope I said those names right. Lovecraft's relatively small body of fiction is of such quality and originality, especially his stories, The Call of Cthulhu, The Whisperer in Darkness, The Color Out of Space, The Shadow Out of Time, and his novellas, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and At the Mountains of Madness, that it not only established him as the leading writer of weird fiction among his contemporaries, but it also secured him a well-deserved place in American literary history. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island, to Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft and Winfield Scott Lovecraft. His parents had a reasonable claim, and arguably the pretensions to match, to old New England aristocracy, with a maternal line that could be traced back to the first waves of settlers in the 17th century, and a long paternal line of English stock. Additionally, they were fortunate to have wealth to match their affectations, thanks to the business success of Lovecraft's maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. Whipple Van Buren Phillips. Tragedy befell the family, however, when Lovecraft's father, a traveling salesman, suffered a severe breakdown in 1983. So Lovecraft, HP, was only 3 years old. Suffered a severe breakdown in 1983. He spent the next 5 years in a sanitarium and died in 1898 of, it has been speculated, syphilitic paresis. Young Howard was largely raised by his mother, her 2 sisters, and their father. Lovecraft's already distressed circumstances grew considerably worse when his grandfather died in 1904. That would make him 14 years old. For the family's firm financial footing disappeared. Lovecraft and his mother, with whom he had a strained relationship, were forced to move into a smaller home. No doubt these family troubles affected the young Lovecraft both physically and mentally. As a teenager, he suffered from a variety of illnesses, many of them, it would seem, connected more to his psychological condition than to biological ailments. Lovecraft responded to these adolescent stresses by pouring his energies into reading and writing. He was particularly drawn to books on science and antiquarian history, as well as Gothic fiction, and his early love for Poe, whom he first discovered at the age of 8, stayed with him throughout his life. A nervous breakdown in 1908, when he was 18, prevented Lovecraft from receiving his high school diploma, but he more than made up for it through deep reading in a variety of fields. He read the classics and taught himself enough Latin to do some minor translation of classical works. His love of science expressed itself through a fascination with chemistry and astronomy, and much of his earliest writings were in these fields. While still a young boy, he developed a keen interest in amateur journalism and produced his own periodicals, the Scientific Gazette, which ran from 1899 to 1907, and the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, which ran from 1903 to 1907. In his mid-teens, he began to contribute occasional articles on various scientific topics to the Providence Tribune, the Providence Evening News, and other local newspapers. Not much is known about the 5 years following Lovecraft's nervous breakdown. He continued his reading and self-education, but he largely kept to himself. His earlier interest in journalism and magazine production gradually brought Lovecraft back into public life. In 1914, he was invited to join the United Amateur Press Association, one of 2 national organizations. The other was the National Amateur Press Association, which Lovecraft also later joined, whose members wrote and published their own independent magazines. For Lovecraft, the invitation to join the UAPA was a small salvation, rescuing him from the cycle of lethargy and depression that had consumed him in his early 20s. His considerable talents as a writer and his extensive literary and scientific background proved just the right mix for a young man now interested in making his mark in the field of journalism, and he quickly became a prominent figure within the UAPA. He produced his own magazine, The Conservative, which ran for 13 issues from 1915 to 1923, and he contributed dozens of articles to other amateur journals. He also served as an editor of the official journal of the UAPA, the United Amateur. He also served as the editor of the official journal of the UAPA, the United Amateur, and later even served as president of the rival NAPA. Paragraph. This revitalization also helped motivate Lovecraft to write fiction again. He had produced a few minor short stories in his mid-teens, including The Beast in the Cave and The Alchemist. But he had set aside fiction writing during the quiet years following his breakdown. In the mid-1910s, however, at the urging of friends associated with the UAPA, Lovecraft decided to try his hand at fiction again, and he produced 2 short stories in 1917, The Tomb and Dagon. These 2 stories, for all practical purposes, mark the beginning of Lovecraft's professional writing career as a master of the weird tale. Although Lovecraft wrote prolifically throughout the rest of his life, fiction was not his primary mode of expression. He wrote journalism, poetry, essays, and a mountain of correspondence, the sum of which makes his fictional output some 60 or so stories and a few short novels seem quite thin by comparison, but it is upon these stories that Lovecraft's considerable reputation rests. I would like to remark, me personally, they say he has 60 or so stories. Right, I eyeballed that. Lovecraft published his fiction in a variety of amateur and startup professional journals edited by associates in the UAPA and NAPA, as well as in the emerging pulp magazines that specialized in genre fiction. One of these pulp magazines, Weird Tales, gradually became his principal publisher. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Lovecraft and Weird Tales came to be associated with one another by the small but dedicated cohort of readers and writers of supernatural horror fiction. In 1921, Lovecraft's mother passed away after a protracted illness that largely confined her for the last 2 years of her life to the same sanitarium where her husband had spent his final years. Shortly after her death, Lovecraft met Sonia Haft Green at a convention for amateur journalists, and they began a courtship. 7 years his senior, Sonia was the proprietor of a hat shop in New York and also wrote stories with supernatural themes. They married in 1924, and Lovecraft joined Sonia in New York. Their marriage was not a happy one. Lovecraft did not feel at home in New York, and he failed to find satisfactory employment. Compounding their misery, Sonia's shop failed and she suffered from bouts of ill health that required her to spend a considerable time away at sanatoriums. Eventually, Sonia moved to Cleveland to pursue new employment, and in 1926, Lovecraft returned with relief to Providence. Although they explored the idea of Sonia joining him in Providence, his aunts decided there was no room in the Lovecraft family for a working woman, and Lovecraft was unequal to the task of standing up to them on Sonia's behalf. They divorced in 1929. Lovecraft did not remarry. Lovecraft's return to Providence initiated his greatest period as a writer of weird tales. Beginning with the Call of Cthulhu in 1926, he wrote many of his most notable works in the following years, including his greatest single statement on the significance and meaning of the weird tale, the study, Supernatural Horror in Literature. In 1927, he penned The Color Out of Space and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Color was published that same year in Amazing Stories, but Dexter Ward only appeared in print in Weird Tales in 1941. And in 1928, he wrote The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929 in Weird Tales. In 1930, he wrote The Whisperer in Darkness, published in Weird Tales in 1931, which was followed in 1931 by At the Mountains of Madness, which appeared in Astounding Stories in 1936, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, published in 1936. The Shadow Out of Time was written in 1934 and published in Astounding Stories in 1936. These works, along with several dozen other lesser-known but strange and imaginative pieces, make up the heart and soul of Lovecraft's weird canon, and they have served as models of the genre for generations since. Despite the quality and originality of his literary output, Lovecraft's work was not commercially published in his lifetime. Only The Shadow over Innsmouth appeared in book form while he was alive, released by a small press in 1936 and not widely distributed. His reputation remained a product of his association with weird tales and other pulps and small magazines. It is fair to say that Lovecraft's popularity today and his rising literary reputation owe much to the work of several of his peers, especially fellow weird fiction writers and aficionados August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, who, starting with the collection The Outsider and Others, 1939, brought Lovecraft's works out of obscurity and preserved them in book form. Unfortunately, the commercial success of Lovecraft's fiction and his subsequent literary fame all came after his untimely passing. During the months leading up to his death, Lovecraft ignored and left untreated the symptoms of intestinal cancer, and when he finally sought help, it was too late. He entered the hospital on March 10, 1937, and on March 15th he was dead. Tales of supernatural horror, weird tales, have a long and rich history in Anglo-American literature. The weird tale of the early 20th century is a direct descendant of the Gothic romance tradition of the late 18th and early 19th centuries in England and America. Starting with the publication of The Castle of Otranto by the English author Horace Walpole in 1765, numerous writers in England and America turned their pens to dark tales of supernatural and preternatural horror, featuring castles, dark subterranean passages, secret societies, madmen, graveyards, hidden manuscripts, and ghosts. These tales were largely explorations of how humans are torn between good and evil, between God and the devil, and frequently choose the latter. Starting with Charles Brockden Brown's novel, Wieland, 1798. The American literary tradition is filled with authors who turned to the artistic possibilities of Gothic fiction as a means to explore the human condition. This was most notable in the first half of the 19th century, when Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and scores of others wrote tales on dark themes marked by a sense of preternatural dread. In the late 19th century, a time better known for its literary realism, even such realist pillars as Henry James occasionally abandoned the drawing room and drafted supernatural tales like The Turn of the Screw, 1898. On the other side of the Atlantic, Lord Dunsany, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, Bram Stoker, and other Victorian fantasy writers kept the Gothic tradition alive and well, with their strange tales of occult activities, unknown terrors, secret societies, and grotesque monsters. Along with Poe, these authors were among the principal influences on Lovecraft, and as he developed his own writing style, he relied heavily on their examples. Tales of supernatural horror do much more than simply induce a chill in the reader. They also serve as a reminder that our knowledge of the world in which we live is incomplete, There are wonders in the cosmos that exist outside of our comprehension, and horror fiction forces us to confront what lies beyond. Thus, the weird tale is often a symbolic form in which the human condition is revealed to be precarious at best. The narrowness of our understanding of the world gives us a false sense of security. Ignorance of the truly monstrous nature of the cosmos is our only comfort. For when the veil is dropped and the horrors of the universe are revealed to us, we are forced to come to terms with our insignificance. The decorum of modern civilization provides only a thin barrier against the cosmic and ever-present pressures ensuring our eventual destruction. The monsters in supernatural horror are symbolic renderings of these ubiquitous, but usually unseen and unknown, threats that violate the manners and values of normative society. As a theorist of the weird tale, Lovecraft is perhaps second only to Edgar Allan Poe in American letters. Lovecraft's study, supernatural horror in literature, is a significant achievement by just about any standard. He began working on it around 1924 at the suggestion of a friend, and after 3 years of deep and wide-ranging reading of weird fiction, he produced an initial version of the essay in the first, and only, issue of a magazine called The Recluse. Several years later, a new version of the work was serialized in a small magazine, The Fantasy Fan, but the complete study did not appear in book form until 1939, when August Derleth and Donald Wandrei included it in their posthumous collection of Lovecraft's writings, The Outsider and Others. According to Lovecraft, tales of supernatural horror connect with some primal emotions at the very core of human nature. Quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." This imbues the weird tale with inherent value as a literary form. Despite the authenticity and dignity of the weird tale, Lovecraft recognizes that the appeal of the spectrally macabre is generally narrow because it demands from the reader a certain degree of imagination and a capacity of detachment from everyday life. Relatively few are free enough from the spell of the daily routine to respond to rappings from outside. Nevertheless, the weird tale will never fall completely out of favor with the reading public, because fear of the unknown is genetically hardwired into human nature. Even if the conscious mind were purged of all sources of wonder, the instinctual genetic drives written into our nervous systems would still compel us to shiver with dread at the dark and shadowy mysteries at the heart of all weird tales. In Lovecraft's view, block quote, "The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with a seriousness and portentousness. A A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. We'll have that one more time. In Lovecraft's view, the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to a rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present. And there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. This definition serves as a useful entry into Lovecraft's own fiction. Like Poe before him, Lovecraft does not locate the true center of his tales in gruesome images of monstrosities, but in the atmosphere they create. In other words, in the effect the tales have on the reader. Lovecraft's aim is to bring readers gradually and carefully to the realization that the world that surrounds us may not be the full portion of the real. The one test of the really weird is simply this: whether or not there be excited in the reader a profound sense of dread, and of contact with unknown spheres and powers, a subtle attitude of awed listening, as if for the beating of black wings or the scratching of outside shapes and entities on the known universe's utmost rim. Dread, that strange mixture of terror, horror, and mystery, is the purest response one can feel at the full realization of the human condition. Lovecraft recognizes that there is a tension at the core of every thinking person. We are driven by our desire for knowledge into uncharted territories, but what we discover in those blank spaces on the map are sea monsters waiting to devour us. Better, perhaps, that we embrace our ignorance. In Lovecraft's vision, the true nature of the cosmos is both infinite and monstrously indifferent. The nature of one of Lovecraft's best known and most celebrated stories, The Call of Cthulhu, presents the horrific triviality of human life against the vastness. We'll have that one again. The narrator of one of Lovecraft's best known and most celebrated stories, The Call of Cthulhu, presents the horrific triviality of human life against the vastness of infinite space. Block quote. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of a black sea of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But some day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Unlike in the works of some of the 19th century Gothic writers, however, Lovecraft's terrors are not the terrors of the devil. They are not rooted in a supernatural struggle between the forces of good and evil. Instead, they arise from the vastness of the cosmos that 19th century science opened up to humanity. The horror we feel is the recognition of our own inconsequence. As the science fiction author and critic Fritz Leiber once observed about Lovecraft, he shifted the focus of supernatural dread from man and his little world and his God to the stars and the black and the unplumbed gulfs of intergalactic space. There is, it might seem to the casual reader of Lovecraft, a strange contradiction at work here. How can an author whose personal education and belief system are so rooted in 19th century science and in philosophical materialism, that is, in the rejection of the supernatural and the belief that physical matter is all that makes up the universe we live in, spend his artistic energies writing tales about strange cults and elder gods and forbidden compendiums of magical spells and occult lore? There is no simple answer to this puzzle, but the search for it takes readers back, first and foremost, to the symbolic nature of the monstrous itself. The so-called elder gods and forbidden books associated with strange, decaying New England towns and mysterious universities peopled with professors who pursue knowledge through profane quests are central to the plot of many of Lovecraft's best works. They are disturbing in large part because they are not presented as mere phantoms or fakes, but as real beings who engulf the lives of Lovecraft's characters in real and often horrific ways. They also, however, serve as symbols that remind us of our insignificance within the cosmos and our ignorance of the world in which we live. The Necronomicon, the forbidden book of magic that appears in several of Lovecraft's stories and novellas, serves as a point of entry into the deeper reality that lies just beyond our awareness, and that evades the comprehension of all but a few imaginative souls. It is a book to which those who seek hidden or forbidden knowledge turn, and this knowledge is as likely to damn them as it is to save those intrepid seekers. For the human mind cannot adequately process the horrible mysteries of the cosmos. We humans are small, our lives only marginally meaningful, and to Lovecraft's alien gods like Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, and Azathoth, we are mere annoyances or playthings if we are lucky, food if we are not. shadowy cults in Lovecraft's fiction keep the memory of these ancient alien gods alive, and it is the unlucky character who stumbles upon these cults engaging in their strange rituals in the middle of a dark swamp. Lovecraft posits that the human mind is simply incapable of comprehending the furthest reaches of a mysterious cosmos, so if ultimate truths were revealed to us, we might, like the title character of Facts Concerning the Late Arthur Germain and His Family, immolate ourselves out of fear and despair. In the 21st century, when Cthulhu has become a plush toy and movies make casual references to the Necronomicon as though it were a real book, it is clear that Lovecraft created a body of work with lasting influence. Though he only wrote a few dozen short stories and novellas, Lovecraft is the 20th century's master of the weird tale, and today his place in the American literary canon is secure. Eric Carl Link is Assistant Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Memphis. Previously, he served as a chair of the Department of English at the University of Memphis, and earlier he held an endowed professorship at North Georgia College and State University, where he also headed the Department of Language and Literature. A two-time Fulbright Specialist Award recipient, he holds a Ph.D. in American Literature from Purdue University and has authored or edited 8 books, including Understanding Philip K. Dick and The Vast and Terrible Drama, American Literary Naturalism in the Late 19th Century. I think this was the person who wrote the preface. And such is the end of the preface. Well, it was only several pages. But as it turns out, I read quite slowly. So I think that worked out to be quite a while. So I think that will make a good stopping point for this video. I didn't know some of those things about Lovecraft. Bertle got married as a young man and couldn't stand up to his family, couldn't stand up to the matriarchy in his family. Never married again. But since no one was looking out for him, he died in his 40s because he had cancer. What an idiot. Kidding, of course. Well, hopefully that was exceedingly boring. And hopefully it was relaxing. That's what I'm trying to get at. Hopefully that was boring, dull, and very relaxing. And if we're lucky, that put you to sleep. Well, we'll be back soon for another one. But for now, sleep tight.